Tragedy and Hope by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 1. Introduction. Western Civilization in its World Setting. Section 1. Cultural Evolution in Civilizations. There have always been men who have asked, "Where are we going?" But never, it would seem, have there been so many of them. And surely, never before have these myriads of questioners asked their question in such dolorous tones, or rephrased their question in such despairing words. Can man survive? Even on a less cosmic basis, questioners appear on all sides, seeking meaning or identity, or even on the most narrowly egocentric basis, trying to find myself. One of these persistent questions is typical of the 20th century, rather than of earlier time. Can our way of life survive? Is our civilization doomed to vanish, as did that of the Incas, the Sumerians, and the Romans? From Giovanni Battista Vico in the early 18th century to Oswald Spengler in the early 20th century, and Arnold J. Toynbee in our own day, men have been puzzling over the problem whether civilizations have a life cycle and follow a similar pattern of change. From this discussion has emerged a fairly general agreement that men live in separately organized societies, each with its own distinct culture, that some of these societies have writing and city life, exist on a higher level of culture than the rest, and should be called by the different term civilizations, and that these civilizations tend to pass through a common pattern of experience. From these studies, it would seem that civilizations pass through a process of evolution which can be analyzed briefly as follows. Each civilization is born in some explicable fashion, and after a slow start enters a period of vigorous expansion, increasing its size and power both internally and at the expense of its neighbors, until gradually a crisis of organization appears. When this crisis has passed and the civilization has been reorganized, it seems somewhat different. Its vigor and morale have weakened, it becomes stabilized and eventually stagnant. After a golden age of peace and prosperity, internal crisis again rises. At this point, there appears for the first time a moral and physical weakness, which raises, also for the first time, questions about the civilization's ability to defend itself against external enemies. Wrecked by internal struggles of a social and constitutional character, without the loss of faith in its older ideologies, and by the challenge of newer ideas incompatible with its past nature, the civilization grows steadily weaker until it's submerged by outside enemies and eventually disappears. When we come to apply this process, even in this rather vague form, to our own civilization, Western civilization, we can see that certain modifications are needed. Like other civilizations, our civilization began with a period of mixture of cultural elements from other societies, formed these elements into a culture distinctly its own, began to expand with growing rapidity as others had done, and passed from this period of expansion into a period of crisis. But at that point, the pattern changed. In more than a dozen other civilizations, the age of expansion was followed by the age of crisis, and this, in turn, by a period of universal empire in which a single political unit ruled the whole extent of the civilization. Western civilization, on the contrary, did not pass from the age of crisis to the age of universal empire, but instead was able to reform itself and entered upon a new period of expansion. Moreover, Western civilization did this not once, but several times. It was this ability to reform or reorganize itself again and again which made Western civilization the dominant factor in the world at the beginning of the 20th century. As we look at these three stages forming the central portion of the life cycle of a civilization, we can see a common pattern. The age of expansion is generally marked by four kinds of expansion. 1 of population, 2 of geographic area, 3 of production, and 4 of knowledge. The expansion of production and the expansion of knowledge give rise to the expansion of population, and the three of these together give rise to the expansion of geographic content. The geographic expansion is of some importance because it gives a civilization a kind of nuclear structure made up of an older core area, which had existed as part of the civilization even before the period of expansion, and a newer peripheral area which became part of the civilization only in the period of expansion and later. If we wish, we can make, as an additional refinement, a third semi-peripheral area between the core area and the fully peripheral area. These various areas are readily discernible in various civilizations of the past and have played a vital role in historic change in these civilizations. In Mesopotamian civilization, 6000 BC to 300 BC, the core area was the lower valley of Mesopotamia. The semi-peripheral area was the middle and upper valley, while the peripheral area, including the highlands surrounding this valley and more remote areas like Iran, Syria, and even Anatolia. The core area of the Cretan civilization was the island of Crete, while the peripheral area, including the Aegean Islands and the Balkan coast. In classical civilization, the core area was the shores of the Aegean Sea. The semi-peripheral area was the west of the northern portion of the eastern Mediterranean Sea, while the peripheral area covered the rest of the Mediterranean shores and ultimately Spain, North Africa, and Gaul. In Canaanite civilization, 2200 BC to 100 BC, the core area was the Levant, while the peripheral area was the western Mediterranean at Tunis, western Sicily, and eastern Spain. The core area of Western civilization AD 400 to sometime in the future has been in the northern half of Italy, France, the extreme west part of Germany, and England. The semi-peripheral area has been Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe and the Iberian Peninsula, while the peripheral areas have included North and South America, Australia, New Zealand, South America, and some other areas. The distinction of at least two geographic areas in each civilization of major importance. The process of expansion, which begins in the core area, also begins to slow up in the core at a time when the peripheral area is still expanding in consequence by the latter part of the age of expansion. The peripheral areas of civilization tend to become wealthier and more powerful than the core area. Another way of saying this is that the core area passes from the age of expansion to the age of conflict before the periphery does. Eventually, in most civilizations, the rate of expansion begins to decline everywhere. It is the decline in the rate of expansion of a civilization which marks its passage from the age of expansion to the age of conflict. This latter is the most complex, most interesting, and most critical of all the periods of the life cycle of a civilization. It is marked by four chief characteristics. It is a period of declining rate of expansion. It is a period of growing tensions and class conflicts. It is a period of increasingly frequent and increasingly violent imperialist wars, and it is a period of growing irrationality, pessimism, superstitions, and otherworldliness. All these phenomena appear in the core area of a civilization before they appear in more peripheral portions of the society. The decreasing rate of expansion of the age of conflict gives rise to the other characteristics of the age. In part, at least, after the long years of the age of expansion, people's minds and their social organization are adjusted to expansion, and it is a very difficult thing to readjust these to a decreasing rate of expansion. Social classes and political units within the civilization try to compensate for the slowing of expansion through normal growth by the use of violence against other social classes or against other political units. From this come class struggles and imperialistic wars. The outcome of these struggles within the civilization are not of vital significance for the future of the civilization itself. What would be of such significance would be the reorganization of the structure of the civilization so that the process of normal growth would be resumed. Because such a reorganization requires the removal of the causes of the civilization's decline, the triumph of one social class over another, or of one political unit over another within the civilization, will not usually have any major influence on the causes of the decline, and will not, except by accident, result in such a reorganization of structure as will give rise to a new period of expansion. Indeed, the class struggles of the imperialist wars of the age of conflict will probably serve to increase the speed of the civilization's decline because they dissipate capital and divert wealth and energies and productive to non-productive activities. In most civilizations, the long-drawn agony of the age of conflict finally ends in a new period, the age of universal empire. As a result, the imperialist wars of the age of conflict, the number of political units in the civilization are reduced by conquest. Eventually, one emerges triumphant. When this occurs, we have one political unit for the whole civilization. Just as the core area passes from the age of expansion to the age of conflict earlier than the peripheral areas, sometimes the core area is conquered by a single state before the whole civilization is conquered by the universal empire. When this occurs, the core empire is generally a semi-peripheral state, while the universal empire is generally a peripheral state. Thus, Mesopotamia's core was conquered by semi-peripheral Babylonia about 1700 BC, while the whole of Mesopotamian civilization was conquered by more peripheral Assyria about 725 BC, replaced by fully peripheral Persia about 525 BC. In classical civilization, the core area was conquered by semi-peripheral Macedonia about 336 BC, while the whole civilization was conquered by peripheral Rome about 146 BC. In other civilizations, the universal empire has consistently been a peripheral state, even though there was no earlier conquest of the core area by a semi-peripheral state. In Mayan civilization, 1000 BC to AD 1550, the core was apparently in Yucatan and Guatemala, but the universal empire of the Aztecs centered in the peripheral highlands of central Mexico. In Andean civilization, 1500 BC to AD 1600, the core areas were on the lower slopes and valleys of the central and northern Andes, but the universal empire of the Incas centered in the highest Andes, a peripheral area. The Canaanite civilization, 2200 BC to 146 BC, had its core area in the Levant, but its universal empire, the Punic Empire, centered at Carthage in the western Mediterranean. If we turn to the Far East, we see no less than 3 civilizations. Of these, the earliest, Cynic civilization, rose in the valley of the Yellow River after 2000 BC, culminated in the Qin and Han empires after 200 BC, and was largely destroyed by Euro-Altaic invaders after AD 400. From this Cynic civilization, in the same way in which classical civilization emerged from Cretan civilization or Western civilization emerged from classical civilization, there emerged 2 other civilizations. Chinese civilization, which began about AD 400, culminated in the Manchu Empire after 1644 and was disrupted by European invaders in the period 1790 to 1930, and Japanese civilization, which began about the time of Christ, culminated in the Tokugawa Empire after 1600, and may have been completely disrupted by invaders from Western civilization in the century following 1853. In India, as in China, 2 civilizations have followed one another. And although we know relatively little about the earlier of the 2, the later, as in China, culminated in a universal empire ruled by an alien and peripheral people. Indic civilization, which began about 3500 BC, was destroyed by Aryan invaders about 1700 BC. Hindu civilization, which emerged from the Indic civilization about 1700 BC, culminated in the Mughal Empire and was destroyed by invaders from Western civilization in the period 1500 to 1900. Turning to the extremely complicated area of the Near East, we can see a similar pattern. Islamic civilization, which began about AD 500, culminated in the Ottoman Empire in the period 1300 to 1600, and has been in the process of being destroyed by invaders from Western civilization since about 1750. Expressed in this way, these patterns in the life cycles of various civilizations may seem confused, but if we tabulate them, the pattern emerges with some simplicity. From this table, a most extraordinary fact emerges. Of approximately 20 civilizations which have existed in all of human history, we have listed 16. Of these 16, 12, possibly 14, are already dead or dying. Their cultures destroyed by outsiders able to come in with sufficient power to disrupt the civilization, destroy its established modes of thought and action, and eventually wipe it out. Of these 12 dead or dying cultures, 6 have been destroyed by Europeans bearing the culture of Western civilization. When we consider the untold numbers of other societies simpler than civilizations, which Western civilization has destroyed or is now destroying, societies such as the Hottentots, the Iroquois, the Tasmanians, the Navajos, and the Caribs, and countless others, the full frightening power of Western civilization becomes obvious. One cause, although by no means the chief cause, of the ability of Western civilization to destroy other cultures rests on the fact that it has been expanding for a long time. This fact in turn rests on another condition to which we have already alluded. The fact that Western civilization has passed through 3 periods of expansion, has entered into an age of conflict 3 times. Each time has had its core area conquered almost completely by a single political unit, but has failed to go on to the age of universal empire, because from the confusion of the age of conflict there emerged each time a new organization of society capable of expanding by its own organizational powers, with the result that the 4 phenomena characteristic of the age of conflict, decreasing rate of expansion, class conflicts, imperialist wars, irrationality, were gradually replaced once again by the 4 kinds of expansion typical of the age of expansion: demographic, geographic, production, knowledge. From a narrowly technical point of view, this shift from an age of conflict to an age of expansion is marked by a resumption of the investment of capital and the accumulation of capital on a large scale. Just as the earlier shift from age of expansion to the age of conflict was marked by a decreasing rate of investment and eventually led to a decreasing rate of accumulation of capital, Western civilization began, as all civilizations do, in a period of cultural mixture. In this particular case, it was a mixture resulting from the barbarian invasions which destroyed classical civilization in the period 350 to 700 by creating a new culture from the various elements offered from the barbarian tribes, the Roman world, the Saracen world, and above all, the Jewish world, Christianity. Western civilizations became a new society. This society became a civilization when it became organized in the period 700 to 970, so there was an accumulation of capital and the beginnings of the investment of this capital and new methods of production. These new methods are associated with a change from infantry forces to mounted warriors in defense, from manpower and the slavery to animal power and energy use, from the scratch plow and 2-field fallow agricultural technology of Mediterranean Europe to the 8-oxen gang plow and 3-field system of the Germanic peoples, and from the centralized, state-centered political orientation of the Roman world to the decentralized, private power, feudal network of the medieval world. In the new system, a small number of men equipped with and trained to fight received dues and services from the overwhelming majority of men who were expected to till the soil. From this inequitable but effective defense system emerged an inequitable distribution of political power, and in turn an inequitable distribution of the socio-economic income. This, in time, resulted in an accumulation of capital, which by giving rise to demand for luxury goods of remote origin, began to shift the whole economic emphasis of the society from its earlier organization in self-sufficient agrarian units, manners, to commercial interchange, economic specialization, and in the 13th century to an entirely new pattern of society with towns, a bourgeois class, spreading literacy, growing freedom of alternative social choices, and new, often disturbing thoughts. From all this came the first period of expansion of Western civilization, covering the years 970 to 1270. At the end of this period, the organization of society was becoming a petrified collection of vested interests, investment was decreasing, and the rate of expansion was beginning to fall. Accordingly, Western civilization for the first time entered upon the age of conflict. This period, the time of the 100 Years' War, the Black Death, the Great Heresies, and severe class conflicts lasted from about 1270 to 1420. By the end of it, efforts were arising from England and Burgundy to conquer the core of Western civilization. But just at that moment, a new age of expansion, using a new organization of society which circumvented the old vested interest of the feudal manorial system began. This new age of expansion, frequently called the period of commercial capitalism, lasted from about 1440 to 1680. The real impetus of economic expansion during the period came from the efforts to obtain profits by the interchange of goods, especially semi-luxury or luxury goods over long distances. In time, the system of commercial capitalism became petrified into a structure of vested interests in which profits were sought by imposing restrictions on the production or interchange of goods rather than by encouraging these activities. This new vested interest structure, usually called mercantilism, became such a burden on the economic activities that the rate of expansion of economic life declined and even gave rise to a period of economic decline in the decades immediately following 1690. The class struggles and imperialist wars engendered by this age of conflict are sometimes called the Second 100 Years' War. The wars continued until 1850 and the class struggles even later. As a result of the former, France by 1810 had conquered most of the core of Western civilization, but here, just as it occurred in 1420, when England had also conquered part of the core of civilization toward the latter portion of an age of conflict, the victory was made meaningless because a new period of expansion began. Just as commercial capitalism had circumvented the petrified institution of the feudal manorial system, chivalry, after 1440, so industrial capitalism circumvented the petrified institution of commercial capitalism, mercantilism, after 1820. The new age of expansion, which made Napoleon's military political victory of 1810 impossible to maintain, had begun in England long before. It appeared as the agricultural revolution about 1725 and as the industrial revolution about 1775. But it did not get started as a great burst of expansion until after 1820. Once started, it moved forward with an impetus such as the world had never seen, and it looked as if Western civilization might cover the whole globe. The dates of this third age of expansion might be fixed at 1770 to 1929, following upon the second age of conflict, 1690 to 1850. The social organization which is at the center of this new development might be called industrial capitalism. In the course of the last decade of the 19th century, it began to become a structure of vested interest to which we might give the name monopoly capitalism. As early perhaps as 1890, certain aspects of the new age of conflict, the third in Western civilization, began to appear, especially in the core area, with the revival of imperialism, the class struggle, of violent warfare, and of irrationalities. By 1930, it was clear that Western civilization was again in an age of conflict. By 1942, a semi-peripheral state, Germany, had conquered much of the core of civilization. That effort was defeated by calling into the fray a peripheral state, the United States, and another outside civilization, the Soviet Society. It is not yet clear whether Western civilization will continue along the path marked by so many earlier civilizations, or whether it will be able to reorganize itself sufficiently to enter upon a new fourth age of expansion. If the former occurs, this age of conflict will undoubtedly continue with the fourfold characteristics of class struggle, war, irrationality, and declining progress. In this case, we shall undoubtedly get a universal empire in which the United States will rule most of the Western civilization. This will be followed, as in other civilizations, by a period of decay, ultimately as the civilization grows weaker, by invasions and the total destruction of Western culture. On the other hand, if Western civilization is able to reorganize itself and enters upon a fourth age of expansion, the ability of Western civilization to survive and go on to increasing prosperity and power will be bright. Leaving aside this hypothetical future, it will appear thus that Western civilization in approximately 1500 years has passed through 8 periods. Thus, mixture 350 to 700, gestation 700 to 970, first expansion 970 to 1270, first conflict 1270 1440, core empire England 1420, second expansion 1440 to 1690, second conflict 1690 1850, core empire France 1810, third expansion 1770 1929, third conflict 1893, core empire Germany 1942. The two possibilities which lie in the future can be listed as follows: reorganization, fourth expansion 1944, or continuation of the process, universal empire of the United States, decay, invasion, end of the civilization. From the list of civilizations previously given, it becomes somewhat easier to see how Western civilization was able to destroy, or still destroying, the cultures of 6 other civilizations. In each of these 6 cases, the victim civilization had already passed the period of universal empire and was deep in the age of decay. In such a situation, Western civilization played a role as an invader similar to that played by the Germanic tribes in classical civilization, and by the Dorians in Cretan civilization, by the Greeks in Mesopotamia or Egyptian civilization, by the Romans in Canaanite civilization, or by the Aryans in Indic civilization. The Westerners who burst in upon the Aztecs in 1519 and the Incas of 1534, and the Mughal Empire of the 18th century on the Manchu Empire after 1790, and the Ottoman Empire after 1774, and on the Tokugawa Empire after 1853. Tokugawa Empire after 1853 were performing the same role as the Visigoths and the other barbarian tribes to the Roman Empire after 377. In each case, the results of the collision of two civilizations, one in the age of expansion and the other in the age of decay, was a foregone conclusion. Expansion would destroy decay. In the course of its various expansion, Western civilization has collided with only one civilization which was not already on the stage of decay. This exception was its half-brother, so to speak, the civilization now represented by the Soviet Empire. It is not clear what stage this Orthodox civilization is in, but it is clearly not in its stage of decay. It would appear that Orthodox civilization began as a period of mixture, 500 to 1300, and is now in its second period of expansion. The first period of expansion, covering 1500 to 1900, had just begun to change in the age of conflict, 1900-1920. When the vested interests of the society were wiped away by the defeat at the hands of Germany in 1917 and replaced by a new organization of society which gave rise to a second age of expansion since 1921. During much of the last 400 years, culminating in the 20th century, the fringes of Asia have been occupied by a semicircle of old dying civilizations, the Islamic, Hindu, Chinese, and Japanese. These have been under pressure from Western civilization coming in from the oceans and from Orthodox civilizations pushing outward from the heart of Eurasian landmass. The oceanic pressure began the Vasco da Gama in India in 1498, culminated aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay in 1945, and still continued with the Anglo-French attack on Suez in 1956. The Russian pressure from the continental heartland was applied to the inner frontiers of China, Iran, and Turkey from the 17th century to the present. Much of the world's history in the 20th century has arisen from the interactions of these three factors: the continental heartland of Russian power, the shattered cultures of the buffer fringe of Asia, and the oceanic powers of Western civilization.